This is For Keeps, a podcast about collections and connections. I'm David Peterkowski. This collector's story centers on one man's love for and obsession with comedy's sultans of slapstick, the clown princes of pratfalls, who've stood the test of time as idolized eye pokers. And if you don't know who I'm talking about, you just might be a knucklehead.
Hello. 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 Hello.
The legends in question, of course, are the Three Stooges, the comedy team that began in vaudeville way back in the 1920s, and are primarily and lovingly remembered for the 190 short films they starred in for Columbia Pictures between 1934 and 1959, in which they transformed so-called low comedy into their fans' idea of high art, punctuated by face slaps, stomach punches, head bonks, usually the latter two being combined, and of course the aforementioned eye pokes. But smacks and pokes will only get you so far in the world of comedy. It helped immensely that the men delivering those blows to one another were also supremely gifted comedians, with impeccable verbal timing to match their physicality. Dishing out most of the abuse was Moe, the Stooges' frequently exasperated leader, played by Moe Howard. His fellow Stooges were the frizzy-haired, well-meaning Larry Fine, and, for their first 97 films, the rotund, childlike Curly Howard, Moe's brother. When Curly was sidelined by illness, he was replaced by another Howard brother, the floppy-haired, dim-witted Shemp. In later years, two other actors filled that third Stooge slot, but it's those first two incarnations of the trio that are the most revered among fans. As for the Stooges' verbal jokes, they came almost as fast and furious as the physical ones, adding many phrases to the comedy vernacular.
I'm a victim of circumstance.
Yeah. Wake up and go to sleep.
Certainly.
Why, you numbskull.
With all that going for them, it's no surprise that they connected with audiences, especially children. And one young fan, who grew up and maintained his love for the Three Stooges well into adulthood, was Gary Lassin. Today, Gary's a retired direct mail executive and accountant who lives near Philadelphia, but his childhood love for the Stooges got reignited as a young man, when he married his wife, who happened to be the grandniece of Larry Fine. Being pulled into the Stooges' orbit so directly led Gary to becoming president of the Three Stooges Fan Club, and he began collecting Stooge memorabilia, both commercially available pieces like board games, toys, and lunchboxes, as well as rare props, scripts, and personal items that belonged to the Stooges themselves. Eventually, Gary's collection grew so immense that in 2004, he opened his own museum dedicated solely to the comedy team, a 3-story building in Ambler, Pennsylvania, that he's dubbed the Stoogeum. With 100,000 items archived inside, the Stoogeum gives visitors the opportunity to enjoy Gary's collection of Stooge-abilia, and it stands as a testament to the trio's longevity in the comedy world. And, as if curating a Three Stooges museum wasn't enough, Gary spent years combing through his own archives, as well as newspaper clippings and the collections of other Stooge enthusiasts, to assemble a new book that chronicles the comedians' long career as live entertainers. The book is called, appropriately enough, A Tour de Farce, the complete history of the Three Stooges on the road. More on that later. Gary's path to Stooge fandom began as it has for many fans, in childhood, when the trio's cartoonish antics captured his fancy.
My first recollection of the Stooges was as a child. We'd come home from school, and at that time, this is the early 60s, there were only 3 TV stations in the Philadelphia area, and one of those 3 stations was airing the Stooges after school. There was a person here called Sally Starr who hosted a show called Popeye Theater. And what I didn't know at the time was every city had a Sally Starr. I didn't know this when I was a kid. But anyway, each afternoon she would show Popeye cartoons and Clutch Cargo cartoons and the Three Stooges. And I was just totally hooked by the Stooges because here were like human cartoons that were doing things that cartoon people did, the falls and the hits and all the other stuff. But if a bomb fell at their feet, it just tattered their clothes. They lived to tell about it. It was kind of, sort of like Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner. That's my earliest recollection, is falling in love with them, after school when I came home.
Uh-huh. So what was it about them that appealed to you, would you say? It's sort of that cartoonish violence, for lack of a better word?
I don't know if it was cartoonish violence, but there were certainly the laws of physics were different in the Stooges world than they were in my world. A shotgun that was fired aimlessly into the sky would hit something with 100% accuracy in a Stooges short. A dropped or a falling object would never land harmlessly on the ground. So there were a lot of things, even as a kid, that was like, wow, this is very interesting. I was just really hooked on them as a kid.
And yet, he strayed from the Stooges as he got older, only to reconnect with them thanks to the woman who later became his wife. Although, truth be told, she wasn't too eager to help Gary make that connection.
My childhood interest in the Stooges sort of waned as I got older because I got interested in other stuff. I got interested in sports and in girls and there was lots of other things. And the Stooges became less and less prominent and sort of forgot about them. And fast forward till I was about 20-some years old and I started dating my future wife. At this point, she revealed she was related to somebody famous, but she was sort of reluctant to let on who it was, as if she was embarrassed almost by who it was. So after I cajoled, and needled and whatever, she finally revealed that it was Larry Fine of the Three Stooges that she was related to. Well, I went nuts once I found this out. I figured I got to find a way to get this girl to marry me because when am I ever going to meet someone who's related to the Stooges? And ultimately, we did get married, and my collecting interest, which I had none of really going into the marriage. I had sort of forgotten about the Stooges. It was all spurred on by meeting her grandfather, who was Larry Fine's brother. And that's really what set me off in the collecting of Stooges, I would say, because up to that point, I wasn't really, I collected baseball cards as a kid, but I didn't collect them like a collector. We played with the cards. We flipped them against the wall. We traded them. We used them in the spokes of our bicycles. So, I collected, but not like a collector would collect and put them in albums, stuff like that. And truthfully, I was looking for something to collect. Baseball cards, at the time, there was only one company making them, and there were only two poses. There was a batter who was standing in a hitting pose, and there was a pitcher who was standing in the pitching pose. Actually, the cards were pretty boring.
The Stooges, on the other hand, were anything but boring to Gary. And when he met his future grandfather-in-law, Gary got back into the mindset of all things Stooges, and into the world of Stooge memorabilia.
Coincidentally, his name was Mo, Morris Feinberg, and they called him Mo. So it's kind of interesting that Larry had two Mo's in his life, Mo Howard and his brother, who was Mo Feinberg. But Mo Feinberg wasn't a collector. He was a family member. He had a comic book, he had a record, and he had letters from his brother. He would show me these things, and I was fascinated by them. And I realized that, hey, Stooge collecting cuts across many, many different hobbies. There's puppets and dolls and autographs and movie posters and even sheet music, and there's all kinds of stuff. There was Three Stooges. I had no idea. Back then, there was no internet. This we're talking about in the 80s, early 80s. It was fun because there was all different stuff, but it wasn't that easy to find. You sort of had to work to find it, which made it sort of challenging. You had to go to shows. You had to leave your business card. You had to sort of work around, and that was sort of the fun part, the chase. And so I really got into it once he introduced me to some of the things that he had, and it was sort of like a snowball that picked up momentum going down the mountain. I couldn't get enough of it, truthfully.
So, getting back to the family for a second, how close was your wife to Great Uncle Larry?
Well, she didn't know him very well because Uncle Larry lived on the West Coast, and she was back here on the East Coast. So he only came to visit occasionally, maybe once every other year or something like that. And truthfully, my wife was terrified of her Uncle Larry. She was afraid of the Stooges because they hit each other and they slapped each other and poked each other. And remember, she was a little girl at this time. She was 4 or 5 years old, in 1959, 1960, when they came back into prominence. And they were scary for a little girl. So she was scared when Uncle Larry was coming. So to mollify her and pacify her, they used to call Larry Uncle Max. They started calling him Uncle Max. And this silly little ruse somehow worked. So she didn't get scared when she heard that Uncle Max was coming. So she was always deathly afraid of him. But, I have several pictures in my recently released book, which we'll talk about maybe later, showing, my wife sitting on Uncle Larry's lap with her sister and a couple other cousins. And Larry was a really, really big family kind of guy. He loved family, and he loved to be with family, hang out with family. And, when he came east, he got together with the nephews and nieces and cousins. And my wife and her sister and her parents were often included in those get-togethers.
Now, when you got to know Morris or Mo Feinberg, is that how you started getting the memorabilia? Did he have a bunch of stuff and kind of give it to you?
Well, no. See, Morris had 2 daughters and 5 granddaughters. So he had no sons or grandsons in his life. And at that point in my life, both of my grandfathers had passed away. So we sort of had a natural bonding. He took to calling me son. I mean, I was the only person who was ever interested in the few things that he had. None of the girls, the women in the family had any interest at all in the Stooges or anything about it. Like I had said earlier, he wasn't a collector. He was just a family member. Larry was his brother. He had a comic book that maybe Larry had sent him once. He had some letters that Larry had sent him or some autographed pictures that Larry had sent him, but he was by no means a collector. He's the one that sort of turned me into a collector, and I went out into the marketplace to start searching for the stuff. And I really had to seek it out. Like I said, at that time, with no internet, there was work to find these things. If you wanted to find comic books, you had to go to a show, and you'd look through boxes and boxes of comic books, and I'd flip through them, Superman, X-Men, Batman. Oh, here's a Stooges one. Oh, I have this one. And I'd put it back, and I'd spend hours at this comic book show flipping through the boxes, and I'd come home with one $5 comic after spending the whole day there. But I left a business card there with a guy, and if you have anything, call me. Well, sure enough, maybe a few weeks later, the guy would call me, and that's how I got into the collecting, and that's how I acquired stuff.
Yeah, you sound like every other collector, so the family connection wasn't necessarily something that brought you into a bunch of Stooge memorabilia.
No, it didn't bring me into a bunch of stuff. What it did bring me into, however, was he was running the Three Stooges Fan Club. And, he was running it as best he could. He was an 80-some-year-old man with a heart condition. And, the quarterly newsletter, it sometimes came out quarterly, but my point is when he passed away, the fan club was sort of leaderless, and it gave me an opportunity to step in and take over the fan club. So in that respect, the family aspect was helpful to me because it just gave me an entree into the fan club, which solidified my whole interest in it and made it into a complete ball of wax.
As for Gary's vast collection of Stooge-abilia, he says that the more unexpected and personal items he's managed to acquire and display at the Stoogeum are the ones that really stand out.
I always like the personal items, the kind of thing that nobody else has. I've got a lot of movie posters that are very valuable, whatever, but, there are other guys that have that poster or similar. I'd have to say, if I can pick out one item, I would say it's Shemp Howard's discharge from the Army. It looks like nothing framed and on the wall. So as a display piece, a lot of collectors want stuff that really looks good and attracts attention and has a wow factor. This has no wow factor, but as a historical piece, and that's where I'm at as a collector. A lot of times I'm more into the historical value as opposed to the wow. Because when all your walls are already filled up, to get a piece with a wow doesn't help. But this is one of the oldest pieces of Stooge-abilia, from 1917-18, where Shemp was discharged from the Army for bedwetting. And the back of the discharge has this medical condition when discharged, and it lists nocturnal enuresis, which is apparently the medical term for bedwetting. So it's a fascinating piece. It's signed by him, Samuel Horwitz, which is, incredibly rare. Very, very few pieces are around surviving today that he signed other than Shemp Howard. So this is signed with his real name, Samuel Horwitz. So it's super duper old, got that great signature, the super duper reason for the discharge. I'd say that's probably my favorite piece. And there's so many other personal pieces. I have some of their driver's licenses and things like that.
And how are you tracking something like that down?
Mostly all of the personal items ultimately came from the relatives. Some of the Stooges were savers and some were not. So, for example, Sheb Howard was a pretty good saver. When he passed away, his wife needed money for stuff, and she was contacted by various collectors. Do you have any stuff? Well, I just happen to have this, blah, blah. Well, what do you want for it? So she sold off a bunch of things over the years. Mo's family sold off a bunch of things, Larry's family. So stuff was out there from the family, and as a collector who wanted the best stuff, I found it. I was able to find it. I did what other collectors do to find stuff. Like I say, I'd left no stone unturned by going to shows and leaving business cards and making phone calls. And the other thing I did that, I don't know, this may sound crazy, but I overpaid for items. And I found that was a very good strategy for getting the best stuff, because I learned very early on, if you're a bargain hunter, that's fine. But if you're a bargain hunter, you're never going to get the best stuff if you have to have a bargain. If there was a piece that was really rare and I wanted it, I was much better off, instead of nickel and diming somebody, just paying their price. And that was a very effective strategy, because people would come up with stuff, and the next time I would get the call first. I was the first person that would get the call. So I wanted the best stuff. I was willing to pay. And people out there, the dealers, they knew my reputation as such. They knew I wasn't going to be somebody who just was buying it to resell at a better price. And it turned out I became sort of like a funnel, where I was at the bottom of that funnel. Stuff funneled to me, all the best stuff.
Sure. And it seems like in your collection you have a mix of commercially available items and actual Stooge-owned or Stooge-used props, costumes, and personal items. Was that always the plan, to kind of have a little bit of everything?
My collecting philosophy is to collect as if I'm the Stooges' mother, which means anything and everything about my boys is fair game for the collection. So it doesn't have to be a major, visible, great graphic piece. It could be just a reference in a news article. That was my collecting philosophy all along. Anything and everything is fair game. And variations. That was, I wanted every variation. If there was, this one had a blue cover and this one had a red cover or whatever, I had to have one of each. I needed to be a completist.
Uh-huh. So I understand you have some scripts, or a fair amount of scripts. Is that accurate?
A fair amount of scripts. Scripts are incredibly rare because there weren't that many made up to begin with. The staff and production crew on these films was very small. So the actors had a script, the director had a script, lighting guy had a script. So when the short was done, film was done, they were trashed. They weren't thought, I'm going to save this and put it on eBay. They weren't thinking that back in 1940. So, the stuff wasn't saved. There was no reason to save it. They were on to the next production. They had another film to make. Mo Howard was the best about that. He saved every single one of his scripts, every one. And a couple of years ago, there was an estate auction where they sold off every one of those scripts that he saved.
Uh-huh. And did you get any of them?
Certainly. I'm sorry. I don't like to do impersonations. I usually leave that to the professionals, but you set me up. I couldn't help it. I did get a few.
So let's talk about some of the commercial items that you have. I understand there were Three Stooges board games and lunchboxes, even a pinball machine. What stands out for you in that part of your collection?
Well, the commercially made items, the mass-produced items, things like that, there's nothing really that stands out because they're mass-produced. So just by definition, a lot of people have them, and there's not that much unique stuff. Like I said, the stuff that I prefer more is more the one-of-the-kind things. But there are a lot of the early items they made back in the 1930s and 40s that are incredibly rare. There's a set of hand puppets from the 30s that are really cool. Pillsbury made a moving picture machine, which was like a cardboard machine that you would crank some films through, films in quotes. There were pieces of cardboard you crank through really fast. It would look like it was a moving picture. So they made a thing for the Stooges that was really cool. And that's, it's one of the nice items from back then. The stuff that was made in the 60s, 70s, and further on was really mass produced for the most part and not as interesting. But, it's fun to collect nonetheless. Some people like, in the Stooges world, only collect toys, only collect games, or only collect posters. I do it all. Like I said, I am a completist. So I do have all the commercially made stuff. As soon we used to, get it as soon as it came out, because oftentimes these licensed items, as soon as they were sold out, that was it. They couldn't get them anymore. So there was no aftermarket back then.
Uh-huh. How about props and costumes? What do you have in that area?
I've got a few things that were used in films. They made a couple feature films towards the end of their careers. One was called The Three Stooges in Orbit that featured this flying submarine tank, and I have one of the props from that film that's really awesome. And Three Stooges meet Hercules. There was a Cyclops character in that film. I have those costumes. I think the coolest costumes I have are the stage jackets that the Stooges wore during the late 1960s. They were very, very colorful, brightly colored. You can imagine psychedelic almost looking jackets from the late 60s that they used to wear on stage. And I have them on prominent display at the Stoogeum. And they're actually one of my favorite items in the collection just because I've got so many pictures of them wearing these jackets on stage. They're one of my favorites, I'd say.
Uh-huh. Very cool. So let's switch gears and talk about your opening of the Stoogeum in 2004. Can you talk a bit about how you got the idea and how you made it all happen?
Well, when I took over the fan club from Mo Feinberg, I didn't know anything about running a fan club. So I sought out advice from this fellow named Paul Wesolowski, who was running the Marx Brothers fan club, which he called the Marx Brotherhood. And he lived nearby, about 45 minutes away. He invited me out to his townhouse. And I went out there, and I could not believe what I saw. I mean, this man was living in a veritable Marx Brothers museum. He was eating off of Marx Brothers plates. He had posters all over the walls. The Marx Brothers alarm clock was waking him up. There's all kinds of rare stuff plastered all over the place. I didn't learn much about running a fan club, but when I left, I thought, man, someday I got to have a place like that that's just Stooges. It was like a man cave that was all Marx Brothers. The only problem was he was not married. He was there all by himself, so he didn't have any other decorator there telling him what he could do. I was married at the time. My wife, like I said, was afraid of the Stooges. There was no way, no how she was going to have Stooges stuff put up in her house. So as I was collecting all this stuff, I was accumulating it in boxes and drawers and notebooks and binders, and it was getting a little upsetting that I couldn't really enjoy my stuff and I couldn't really show it off to anybody else. We were having annual conventions that I could schlep, 6, 8, 10, 12 items to, a few boxes of stuff, but there was no way I could bring it all. So I was getting increasingly frustrated with just not being able to show off or even look at my stuff myself. So at one point I just decided I'm going to bite the bullet. I'm going to build a building like Paul Wesolowski had and make it a Stooges shrine, make it like a Stooges man cave, a place that the Stooges would be proud of and a place that a Stooges fan would want to have his ashes scattered over when he passed away, that kind of place.
But when it came to actually creating the museum, Gary was a neophyte, but he was no numbskull, so he wisely found the help he needed to turn his idea of a Stooges shrine into reality.
I didn't know anything about making a museum, so I engaged a museum design firm, and of course they knew nothing about Stooges. So I was blind on one hand, and they were blind on the other hand, but working together, we scoped out this project, and it's been very, very well received in the 15-plus years that it's been in existence. Of course, it's designed for a Stooge fan, but of course, a lot of the Stooges fans bring their wives and significant others that are not fans, and even they appreciate it as a history place, as a place where they can see old toys and games from their childhoods and watch the old black and white films and see the cheesy special effects from back in the day. So it's been very well received, and it was 3, 4, 5 years in the making, truthfully, because like I said, the design firm didn't know Stooges and I didn't know design, but we got it done, and I've been really happy with it and gotten a lot of repeat visitors. People like to come back. There's so much stuff plastered on the walls. The design philosophy is put so much stuff up there that if people come back for the umpteenth time, they'll still see some stuff that they hadn't noticed before.
So there's not like a curly wing and a Shemp room?
Well, I actually do have a hall of Shemp. It was going to be the wall of Shemp, but there was so much stuff that it covered 2 walls, and so it didn't make sense to call it the walls of Shemp, so it became the hall of Shemp. So that's what happened there.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
And I know the pandemic has thrown a monkey wrench into your plans a bit, but how many people are typically visiting the Stoogeum each year?
Well, it's hard to say, like you said, because we were probably getting 4,000 or 5,000 visitors a year before, but now we're getting far fewer because we're only open by appointment. We used to be open every Thursday We'd have an open house, and whoever would come. But I can't accommodate large crowds unexpectedly now, and I don't want to have large crowds in the building for health and safety reasons, and also just for crowd control reasons. So we're open only by appointment at this time, which is reducing the attendance. But perhaps at some point in the near future, we'll get back to having open houses. I haven't quite decided yet.
So what items on display generate the most excitement among your visitors?
That's an interesting question. I'm not really sure because, like I say, everybody's interested in certain things. I have these life-size mannequins in the entrance hall, and they're sort of unremarkable. I mean, they're pretty good likenesses, but they're unremarkable. What's remarkable about them that people are fascinated is how little the Stooges were, because they're supposed to be life-size, and you've got Moe and Larry, at 5'4", and I've got Curly there at about 5'5", and people walk up to them and they're sort of fascinated because almost everyone is looking down at them. Even, adolescent girls are the same size as these Stooges, and people are constantly asking, is that how big they were? And the answer is yes. Yeah, they were little guys. It's funny, if you watch the films, there's so many of these films where they make the play for these beautiful actresses, and these actresses are towering over the Stooges. I mean, the Stooges are looking up to these women, so these women seem like they're 6 feet tall or 6'2", like they're Amazons of some sort. And over the years at the conventions, we've had these women come. They're little teeny ladies. These ladies are little. They're no more than 5'5", 5'6", and they put on 2 or 3 inch heel, and they were towering above the Stooges at that little height. I was always amazed when we met these women in person, how little they were, because they were towering over the boys. So
probably made it even funnier in a way.
Well, that was part of the humor there, that these ugly Stooges are not only making a play for these beautiful women, unabashedly, unashamedly, but the women were so much bigger than, as if they had a chance with these girls. So,
yep. So there's an article online that says you have 100,000 items in your collection and 3,500 are on display at the museum. Does that sound accurate to you still?
Well, I guess I didn't count. See, there's a problem with counting this stuff, because if I buy a set of puppets, I counted that set of puppets as one item, but it's 3 puppets. You know what I mean? So a lot of the stuff, that I count as one is times a factor of 3. There's a lot of stuff that was sold in sets of 3. So the count is, it's hard to say, but I've got a lot of Stooge-abilia here. There's no question about that.
Uh-huh. And so where do you keep the rest of it? The stuff not on display?
It's in the same boxes and drawers and binders. But I find that 3-ring binders, for me, are a very effective storage. I have a lot of photographs. We've probably got 20,000. I don't know. We got a lot of photographs, 20,000 photographs that are in 3-ring binders, just because it's really easy to flip through them that way and store them. I've got architect blueprint files, which are very skinny drawers so as not to hold too much weight, but hold large posters and things like that are stored in an architect's blueprint files. 16 millimeter and 8 millimeter films are stored in gas-free cans in a film library that's temperature controlled. And so every item that's not on display is stored in a different way. It depends what type of item it is.
Wow.
And I'm not well versed in museum or best practices. However, I have a 2-person staff that is, and they make sure that I'm up to snuff on museum best practices, whatever they may be, with regard to storage and record retention and all that stuff.
Yeah. Well, you don't want to be a knucklehead about it.
Certainly not. I don't want to be a victim of circumstance.
And no discussion of the Three Stooges' place in history would be complete without delving into their overt mockery of Adolf Hitler and the rumor that their jokes got under the Führer's skin. I read someplace that they were the first in Hollywood to, at least through their films, rail against Adolf Hitler, and they actually wound up on Hitler's death list, apparently. Do you have anything related to that trivia in your collection?
The Stooges' film called Unazdi Spy was the first film that was released to mock Hitler. Because when this film came out in January of 1940, the United States had not entered World War II at the time. So we were still neutral at this time. And Hollywood was taking a position that, we were not going to take sides. So the Stooges released this film in January 1940, which was the first to spoof Hitler. However, they were aware that Charlie Chaplin had been making a film called The Great Dictator, which was in production. I believe that Chaplin's film, The Great Dictator, was in production before the Stooges. So he was working on this film, and I'm sure the Stooges, not the Stooges, but the people at Columbia Pictures behind the films knew that he was working on this film. But the Stooges got their film out first, and the Stooges were the first to release a film that spoofed Hitler. Now, this talk about being on Hitler's death list, I believe, is totally bogus and sort of urban legend. There's certainly no evidence that's the case, and I'm very, very skeptical of it because we know that Columbia Pictures film distribution overseas was very, very limited. We don't know how Hitler would have gotten his hands on this film, and certainly not gotten it translated into German. So we're very, very suspect that he would have even had the possibility of seeing this film. We think that the urban legend started from a Weekly World News, that tabloid publication that's similar to the National Enquirer, an article that appeared in that paper maybe 20 or 25 years ago with the heading about Stooges appearing on Hitler's death list. The article then proceeded to not mention anything about the Stooges being on Hitler's death list other than they spoofed Hitler. So I think that's what got it started, and I think there's absolutely no truth to that. If he had a death list, everybody who was Jewish would have been on the list anyway. So were they on the list? Yeah, they were on the list. They were Jewish.
Over the years, Gary has heard about other Stooges fans whose collections include handwritten letters from the Stooges themselves. Impressive artifacts for sure, but given the Stooges' off-screen kindness, apparently not all that rare.
Moe and Larry wrote to everyone that wrote to them. And not only did they write back, they had pen pals that they would carry on these conversations with for years back and forth. Moe, especially, when he responded to somebody's letter, he would handwrite these 2-3 page letters in great detail about how, yes, you should listen to your mom, and yeah, I had a horse when I was a kid, and I found that when I told the horse this, blah, 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 someone was taking horse riding lessons. They were wonderful, wonderful letter writers with their fans, and very, very open with their fans. So there's many, many people out there that had contacts like this, that met them first person, that have these stories. I can't tell you how many stories I've heard of kids that wanted to meet Moe Howard. They looked him up in the phone book. He's listed in the phone book. They went to his house. They rang the doorbell. Mrs. Howard answered the door and invited him in for milk and cookies.
Unreal.
And then met Moe Howard. It was just such a different era back then. Crazy, actually.
It is. So I want to switch gears once again and ask you about your new book. What can you tell me about how you got the idea for it and what it's about?
I would say in the mid-1990s, I was standing in line and I saw somebody wearing a Rolling Stones T-shirt. It was a shirt for the Steel Wheels tour, and it listed all the cities they appeared in: Atlanta, Georgia, Nashville, Chattanooga. I thought, wow, that's great. The Stones, they have every city they appeared on that tour. Wouldn't it be great if we had something like that for the Stooges? Because no one had ever made a list of all the places the Stooges played. And I just sort of tucked that away. A few days later, I saw another person wearing a concert tour shirt, but not for the Stones. It was for some totally unknown group I never heard of. I don't even remember who it was, the Royal Bozos or whatever it was. So I'm thinking to myself, the Royal Bozos probably only lasted a month or two, and yet their whole tour history is documented. The Stooges toured for 50 years, and we don't have anything. We have no documentation of where they were. So I opened an Excel spreadsheet. It's just for fun. I wasn't going to write a book. I wanted to see what I could do. I wanted to make a list of all the places. I wanted my T-shirt. I wanted a T-shirt with a list of all the places the Stooges played. So I went through my collection because I had playbills and I had some ticket stubs. I had some programs, and I thought, yeah, let's see what I can do. So I started putting the dates together, and it was sort of like a crossword puzzle. At first, I didn't have much. But the more I had, I could put the dots together. I could see, let's see, the first week in August, they're in Cleveland. The third week, they're in Philly. Where would they be in between the second week? I look at a map. Here's Cleveland. Here's Philly. They were in Pittsburgh. I'll bet they were in Pittsburgh. It's right in between. I'd go to Library of Congress. I went to the Pittsburgh newspapers for that week. Sure enough, yes, they were in Pittsburgh that week. I filled in the spreadsheet. Now I know they're in Pittsburgh. I asked the fans in the fan club, send me copies of your programs and your playbills and dates that you have. And people sent me stuff. And I started going back to Library of Congress, and they had all kinds of newspapers there from all kinds of cities all over the place. This was before the internet. So I started, putting this list together, and I was getting a critical mass. I was getting a lot of stuff together. And then all of a sudden, in the around 2010, people started releasing newspapers online, digitized, where you could just type in Three Stooges and get all these results back. It was like, wow, this is so easy, because what I had been doing was going through microfilm at the Library of Congress. And let me tell you, looking through microfilm is one tedious job. You can't search. You got to pour through page by page. So I got to the point where, hey, if I combine this spreadsheet with all these rare photos I've got in my collection, I got a book here. It took 5-6 years of work to come up with the end product, which I've titled A Tour de Farce, The Complete History of the Three Stooges on the Road. And it covers their travels on the road from the earliest days, the 1920s, all the way till 1970. It's a piece of Stooges history that's totally not covered by all the hundreds of books that are out there on the market. There's no book out there that covers their travels on the road, and they spent a lot of time on the road. Let me tell you, they spent months at a time on the road, as opposed to a month a year in front of the camera. So even though the lion's share of their time was spent traveling, there's never been any book to document it until now. And that was the motivation for writing this book and filling this void in the Stooges marketplace.
It's amazing. And I think it's worth noting that, as far as I understand, the Stooges did much better financially on tour than they did making films. Is that true?
It is true. They were able to keep all the money they made on the road. And like I said, they were on the road for 2, 3, 4 months at a time. And that's a crazy lifestyle. As I wrote, when I read this book, that a lot of times they were doing these one-night stands for, packing up and then do 4 shows a night and packing up and moving on to the next town, and 4 more shows, move on to the next town. And it's a very, very challenging lifestyle, but they got used to it when they were young, and they didn't mind it. It seemed like they enjoyed it.
Yeah. Interesting. So one last question for you. I'm going to generalize here, and maybe I shouldn't, but can you explain why women tend to not find them that funny?
Well, I use this. Why would a woman find them funny? They're not good-looking guys. They don't have steady jobs, and they got lousy table manners. Why would a woman like them? I mean, it's how many? I guess I put this analogy: how many male fans are there of the Golden Girls? I don't know. I guess that's the reason I see is, like I said, they're not good looking, no steady job, no table manners, nothing appealing about them at all. But I can tell you this, as president of the fan club, there are a lot of women in the club, and they would take offense if they were told that women don't like the Stooges, because they can recite the lines and the slaps and pokes right with the best of them. The one difference I see between the women and the men is women do not tend to be collectors of the memorabilia as men do. I don't think that's just, in the Stooges. I see when I go to shows, and you go to these collector shows, typically you'll find that they're just dominated, movie memorabilia shows that are just dominated by men. It's not just the Stooges stuff, but, when you go to these comic book shows or movie memorabilia shows, like I say, autograph shows, it seems like men are dominating those hobbies. But there are a lot of women fans in the club, not nearly as many as men, but they're pretty hardcore. And, they defend themselves when they hear the women are not fans. They can recite the lines with the best of them, like I said.
Are they taller than the male fans?
I don't know, but they know how to give an eye poke and a face slap, I can tell you that.
Well, Gary, when it comes to time, sadly, we're both victims of circumstance, which is my Stooge-friendly way of saying we're out of time. But I want to thank you so much for filling me in on your Stooge collection and the Stoogeum and your new book. This has been a lot of fun.
It's been the same for me. I hope I gave you something that you can use, and an eye poke to all the Stooge fans out there.
Happily received. Thanks again.
Yeah, you're welcome. Take care.
Okay, bye-bye. Well, the last of the Three Stooges may have died decades ago, but the legacy of the comedy team lives on, thanks in no small part to superfans like Gary Lassin and his seriously stacked Stoogeum. And remember, if you're ever in the Philadelphia area, the Stoogeum and its massive collection are available for visits by appointment. Just be sure to ring the doorbell.
The doorbell isn't working. Can you fix it?
Can we fix it?
Can we fix it? Can we?
Quiet.
For Keeps is a production of me, David Peterkovsky. My thanks to Gary Lassin for talking about the Three Stooges memorabilia collection he's assembled and put on display for all to see, eye pokes notwithstanding, at the Stoogeum in Ambler, Pennsylvania. At forkeepspodcast.com, you'll see photos of Gary and some of the standout pieces from his staggering Stooges collection. And you'll find links to the Stoogeum website and to Gary's book. It's all enough to make you drop to the floor and run around in circles. The show's theme song is by Still Flyin, and the closing theme is by Eric Frisch. Additional music for this episode was generously provided by Tuba Skinny. Thanks for listening to For Keeps. Until next time, keep on keeping on. I should get there sometime.
You'll get an eye poke in person.
That sweetens the deal for sure.